Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take concepts you hear all the time, grab the sources, and really break down what's going on. Today, we're tackling a big one, a term that's everywhere in American culture, books, movies, you name it, the rapture.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Culturally huge, but when you dig into the theology and history, it's actually quite specific. So, at its core, the rapture is what theologians call an eschatological concept. Basically, a belief about the end times, and it's held primarily by certain segments of Christianity, particularly, within American evangelicalism.
Okay, so what is it, fundamentally?
It's defined as this end time event where Christians who've already died are resurrected, and then they're immediately joined by believers who are still alive, and they all rise up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. That's the classic description from Scripture.
Right, that image is very vivid. But here's what jumped out at me from the sources right away. This specific idea isn't ancient, not like, say, the resurrection or the Trinity.
Not at all. That's a crucial point.
The sources seem to pin the origin of this particular doctrine, the idea of a distinct sort of secret removal of the church, to the 1830s, relatively recent history.
That's exactly right, the 1830s. And it's tied, really intrinsically tied, to a specific way of interpreting the Bible called dispensational premillennialism.
Dispensationalism. Okay, unpack that for us. That sounds like a key piece of the puzzle.
It absolutely is. Dispensationalism is a framework, a system really, for understanding the Bible. It divides history into different periods or dispensations. And in each one, the idea is that God interacts with humanity or administers his plan in a slightly different way.
And the crucial part for the rapture doctrine is?
The crucial part is that this system draws a very sharp distinction between God's plan for the nation of Israel and God's plan for the church. They're seen as two distinct peoples of God with two distinct programs.
Ah, okay. So if God has these separate tracks, one for Israel, one for the church, what does that imply for the end times?
Well, it implies they can't really coexist during the final period of judgment, often called the tribulation, which dispensationalists see as primarily focused on God dealing with Israel and judging the unbelieving world.
So the church has to be out of the way.
Precisely. That theological framework almost necessitates the church being removed, raptured, before that final 7-year tribulation period begins. It clears the stage, so to speak, for God to turn his focus back specifically to Israel.
That makes sense within that system. It creates the need for a two-stage return then. First the removal, then the final coming.
Exactly. First, Christ comes for his church, the rapture. Then later, after the tribulation, he comes with his church to judge the world and set up his kingdom, the second coming.
Okay, that's a helpful framework. Before we get deeper into all the different timings and debates, let's talk about the word itself, rapture. If early English Bibles, like the King James, used caught up, where did rapture come from?
Good question. Yeah, we need to follow the linguistic trail. It starts, of course, with the original Greek New Testament. The key verse is 1 Thessalonians 4.17. In the original Koine Greek, the verb used is harpagasometa.
Harpagasometa. And that means?
It means we shall be caught up or we shall be taken away. But the root word, harpazo, that's arpaja, has a pretty strong meaning.
Strong how?
Well, it means things like to snatch away, to seize, often implying force or suddenness. Think of like a bird of prey snatching something. That kind of speed and decisiveness is in the word.
Wow, okay, so snatch or seize, that's quite intense. Then it goes from Greek to Latin.
Exactly. When the Bible was translated into Latin, the version known as the Vulgate, that Greek word harpagasometa became rapiomor.
Rapiomir.
Which also means we will be caught up. Yeah. And it comes from the Latin verb rapio. And rapio also carries connotations of seizing or carrying off.
And rapio sounds awfully close to?
To rapture, right. From the past participle raptus, we eventually get the medieval Latin noun raptura.
And rapturement.
It meant a seizure, a carrying off, even kidnapping in some contexts. So the English word rapture inherits that sense of being suddenly seized or taken away.
It's fascinating how the word itself carries that dramatic weight. So older translations, like the King James Version, used caught up, which is a direct translation.
Yes, very accurate. Caught up. The Geneva Bible, too.
But the term rapture, as this specific, separate, pre-tribulation event, That's a later interpretive label placed onto the concept derived from those Latin roots.
Precisely. It became the theological shorthand for this particular doctrine, solidifying mainly within certain Protestant movements, especially, as you mentioned, in the UK, and then really taking off in the US from the 19th century onward.
Okay, so we've got the origin, the word. Let's get into the core disagreement. You said this specific rapture doctrine isn't the majority view in Christianity. Why not? What's the fundamental split?
The split is really about whether Christ's return is one single event or two distinct stages separated by time. The overwhelming majority of Christian traditions throughout history, and today we're talking the Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox churches, Anglicans, Lutherans, Reformed traditions, Methodists, they don't subscribe to this specific rapture theology.
So what do they believe about that First Thessalonians passage, the caught up in the clouds part?
They interpret that aerial gathering, as theologians sometimes call it, as happening at the same time as the final, visible second coming of Christ. It's all one event, not a separate preliminary trip.
So no secret coming for the saints 7 years before a public coming with the saints.
Exactly. The historic view sees the return of Christ as a single, triumphant public event. When he returns visibly, that's when the dead are raised, the living believers are transformed, and they all meet him together. No gap. No tribulation period in between these things.
And this is the view held by major figures throughout church history, like Augustine or Aquinas.
Yes. For well over 1,000 years, really up until the 1800s, the dominant understanding wasn't about escaping a period of earthly tribulation. It was about the resurrection. The faithful who have died are raised, and those alive at the time are changed and caught up together to meet the returning Lord as part of his final advent. It wasn't seen as a mechanism to avoid suffering, but as the culmination of history.
Okay, so that distinction is huge. Non-dispensationalists. Christ returns once. At the end, gathering believers then. Dispensational premillennialists. Christ returns twice, effectively. First secretly for the church, then publicly with the church.
That's the essential difference, yes. That for and with distinction is key to their timeline, coming for the church in the rapture, removing them. Then after the tribulation, coming with the church in glory for the final judgment and kingdom.
The implications are massive. But let's zoom in again on the group that does believe in this separate rapture event, the premillennials. You mentioned there's debate within that group.
Oh, absolutely. If you accept the idea of a rapture separate from the second coming, the next big question becomes, when does it happen relative to the tribulation? And that's where things get really complex.
They agree it's separate, but not on the timing.
Correct. There's a whole spectrum of views, all trying to pinpoint the rapture's timing relative to this prophesied 7-year period of intense trouble.
And the view most people have probably heard of, thanks to books and movies, is the pre-tribulation view.
That's definitely the most popular one today. Pre-tribulational premillennialism, or pre-trib for short.
And pre-trib means?
It means the rapture happens before the 7-year tribulation period even starts. The church is completely removed from the earth, spared from the entire 7 years of judgment and wrath that follow.
You can see the appeal of that, promising complete escape from a time described in, well, pretty terrifying terms.
Absolutely. Its popular appeal is undeniable. As we said, it gained theological ground with figures like John Nelson Darby in the 1830s. But its massive popularization came later. Things like the Scofield Reference Bible, first published in 1909, were hugely influential. It included notes right alongside the biblical text explaining passages from a dispensational, pre-tribulational perspective. Millions of Christians used it.
And then, more recently, the cultural phenomenon of the Left Behind book series.
Right. Those novels, starting in the mid-90s, sold, nearly 80 million copies? They depicted a dramatic pre-trib rapture and its aftermath, embedding that specific timing deep into the popular Christian imagination and even beyond.
So pre-trib is the dominant view among rapture believers. Church gets out before the bad stuff starts. But what are the other options if you're a premillennialist but don't buy the pre-trib timing?
Well, there are several other main camps, and they all involve the church going through at least part of the tribulation. They challenge that idea of total escape.
Okay, walk us through them. What's the next main view?
A significant minority view is the mid-tribulational position, or mid-trib.
Mid-tribulation, so halfway through.
Exactly. Proponents believe the rapture happens in the middle of the 7-year period, after the first 3.5 years. They also distinguish between the first half, sometimes seen as man's wrath or Satan's wrath, and the second half called the Great Tribulation, which they see as God's wrath being poured out more directly. They believe the church endures the first part, but is raptured before the worst of God's judgment falls.
Is there specific scripture they point to for that midpoint timing?
Often they look at passages like Daniel 7.25, which talks about the saints being persecuted for a time, times, and half a time, interpreted as 3.5 years. Or references in Revelation to a 42-month or 1,260-day period. They see the midpoint as a significant marker.
Okay, so mid-trib endures half, escape the worst half. What else? You mentioned a pre-wrath view. How's that different?
Right, the pre-wrath view is a bit more nuanced and has gained traction more recently. It also sees the church going through a portion of the 7 years, but it defines the timing differently than mid-trib.
How so?
Pre-wrath advocates place the rapture later in the second half of the 7-year period. They argue the church will endure most of the tribulation, including the reign of the Antichrist and significant persecution. However, they believe the church is raptured before the specific, final outpouring of God's wrath known as the Day of the Lord.
So they differentiate between the general awfulness of the tribulation and God's specific final judgment phase.
Exactly. They'd say the church experiences persecution, even martyrdom, which they might see as man's wrath or Satan's wrath, but is removed just before God unleashes his ultimate judgments, often associated with the trumpet and bowl judgments described in the book of Revelation. They emphasize texts that seem to place the rapture after certain tribulation events, like the cosmic signs sun darkened, moon turned to blood mentioned in Matthew 24 and Revelation 6.
So pre-wrath believers expect to suffer quite a bit, just not God's final divine hammer blow, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it. Suffer man's wrath, escape God's wrath. Then there's another, less common view, the partial rapture theory.
Partial rapture, meaning not everyone goes.
Yeah, that's the idea. This view suggests that maybe the timing isn't the same for all believers. It proposes that only those Christians who are deemed sufficiently watchful, obedient, or spiritually ready will be raptured before the tribulation.
And the others, the less watchful Christians.
Well, the idea is they might be left behind to endure some or all of the tribulation, perhaps being raptured later in stages, or maybe they have to go through that suffering to be purified. It ties worthiness or preparedness to escaping the tribulation.
That adds another layer of complexity, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, partial. Is there one more main timing view within premillennialism?
Yes, the post-tribulational view, or post-trib.
Post means after. So the rapture happens after the tribulation.
Correct. Post-tribulational premillennialism teaches that the rapture happens at the very end of the 7-year tribulation period.
Wait, if it happens at the end, how is it different from the second coming? It sounds like it collapses back into the traditional view.
That's the key point, and why it's sometimes debated if it should even be under the same umbrella. Post-tribulationists do see the rapture and the second coming as essentially simultaneous events. They believe Christians will live through the entire tribulation period, facing the persecution, the Antichrist, everything. Then, at the end of those 7 years, Christ returns visibly, the dead in Christ are raised, the living believers are caught up to meet him in the air, and they immediately descend with him to judge the nations and establish his kingdom.
So they hold on to the premillennial idea of a future earthly kingdom, but they reject the dispensational idea that the church must be removed before the tribulation.
Precisely. They argue that the church is appointed to suffer tribulation, just not God's wrath, and they point to passages like Matthew 24.2931, which explicitly says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, he will sell his angels, and they will gather together his elect. They see no biblical basis for a separate, earlier removal.
Wow. So within the camp that believes in a distinct rapture event, the views range from total escape before any trouble, pre-trib, to enduring the entire period of trouble, post-trib. That's a huge difference in expectation.
It really is. It fundamentally shapes how believers understand suffering, God's protection, and their role in the world during what they perceive as the end times. Escape versus endurance. It's a major dividing line.
Okay, let's pull the lens back again. We've spent a lot of time on premillennialism because that's where the rapture debate lives. But you mentioned other views about the millennium itself. How do they fit in or rather not fit in with this rapture timing debate?
Right. So, premillennialism in all its forms, pre, mid, post-trib, etc., believes in a literal future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth after his return. That's the millennium. But there are two other major viewpoints that interpret that 1,000-year period mentioned in Revelation 20 very differently, postmillennialism and amillennialism. And neither of them has this complex rapture timing system.
Let's take postmillennialism first. What's their view?
Postmillennialism is historically quite optimistic. They believe the millennium isn't necessarily a literal 1,000 years, but rather a long period of time before Christ's return, during which the gospel will gradually triumph, Christianizing the world and bringing about an age of peace and righteousness through the influence of the church.
So the world gets better and better leading up to Christ's return.
That's the general idea. Then, at the end of this successful gospel age, Christ returns. And his return is a single event encompassing the resurrection of the dead, the gathering of the saints, what others might call the rapture, the final judgment, all at once. There's no tribulation period separating stages.
Okay, so postmillennialism sees the rapture element as part of the one final return after a long golden age. What about amillennialism? The A usually means no millennium.
Sort of. Amillennialism doesn't mean no millennium, but rather no literal future earthly 1,000-year reign after Christ's return. They interpret the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 symbolically.
Symbolically of what?
They generally see the millennium as representing the current church age, the period between Christ's first coming, his resurrection and ascension, and his future second coming. Christ is reigning now, spiritually, from heaven through his church.
So the millennium is happening now spiritually.
Yes, that's the core idea. And like postmillennialism, amillennialism sees the second coming as a single, final, future event. When Christ returns, that's when the general resurrection, the final judgment, and the ushering in of the eternal state all happen. The catching up of believers, 1 Thessalonians 4, is part of that one climactic event at the end of history.
And you said amillennialism is the view of many major denominations.
It is. It's the traditional view held by the Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodoxy, and many mainline Protestant denominations like Lutherans and Anglicans, as well as many Reformed churches. Historically speaking, it's probably been the dominant view through much of church history.
So for amillennialists and postmillennialists, this whole intricate debate about pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib rapture timing is, well, it's irrelevant to their framework.
Entirely irrelevant. Because they don't see a need for a separate rapture event distinct from the final second coming in the first place.
Okay. Now this brings us to something really fascinating and maybe a bit troubling that emerges from the sources, especially concerning those who hold the more specific, timed rapture views, the history of failed predictions.
Yes. The belief in a specific imminent rapture, often tied to interpreting current events through a prophetic lens, has unfortunately led to numerous attempts throughout history to pinpoint the exact date.
It seems almost counterintuitive, given that Jesus himself said in the Gospels, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father."
It does seem counterintuitive. Yet the desire for certainty, perhaps combined with the conviction that one has unlocked the correct interpretive key, like the dispensational system, can lead people to believe they can discern the times or even the dates, despite those warnings.
The sources list quite a few examples. One of the earliest and most famous failures was the Great Disappointment.
Ah, yes, William Miller, a Baptist preacher in the early 19th century. He became convinced through intense study of biblical prophecies, particularly in Daniel and Revelation, that Christ would return sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844.
And when March 1844 passed,
Well, there was some recalculation among his followers, the Millerites. A new specific date was set, October 20th, 1844. Thousands gathered, sold possessions, waited expectantly, and Christ didn't return visibly. It was a profound crisis of faith for many, hence the name Great Disappointment. Though interestingly, several religious movements, like the Seventh-day Adventists, trace their origins back to the aftermath of this event.
so that was a major early example. But the predictions didn't stop there.
Not by a long shot. Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the movement that became Jehovah's Witnesses, also made several predictions based on his interpretations. He pointed initially to 1914 as a pivotal year for the establishment of God's kingdom, and later dates like 1918 and 1925 were also emphasized by the Watchtower Society, with expectations that didn't materialize as predicted.
Moving into the 20th century, especially with mass media, these predictions could reach huge audiences, couldn't they?
Absolutely. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Chuck Smith, founder of the Calvary Chapel movement, gained attention for suggesting Jesus would likely return by 1981. He based this partly on a 40-year generation timeline, starting from the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. When 1981 passed, he had to revise his stance.
And then there was the huge event in 1988.
Oh, yes. Edgar C. Whisenant, a former NASA engineer, he published a booklet called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. It sold millions of copies, primarily through Christian bookstores and networks. He pinpointed the rapture to occur during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, between September 11th and 13th, 1988.
I remember hearing about that. It caused quite a stir, didn't it? Panic in some quarters.
It really did. People quit jobs, spent savings, prepared intensely. When the dates passed, Wisenet revised his prediction for 1989, then later years, but the initial impact was massive and the failure quite public.
And perhaps the most prominent recent example is Harold Camping.
Harold Camping and his family radio network. He became notorious for predicting the rapture multiple times. First, he focused heavily on September 6, 1994.
Which obviously didn't happen.
No. But undeterred, years later, he developed an incredibly complex system of biblical numerology and declared with absolute certainty that Judgment Day would begin with a worldwide rapture on May 21st, 2011.
That one got huge media attention globally.
Right.
Billboards, campaigns.
Massive. His followers spent fortunes promoting the date. When May 21st came and went uneventfully, Camping initially claimed a spiritual judgment had occurred which wasn't visible. The public reaction was largely ridicule, and the personal and financial devastation for many of his followers was tragic.
And he revised it again after that, didn't he?
He did. He then claimed the actual end of the world would be October 21st, 2011. When that also passed, Camping largely withdrew from public view, admitting his calculations were wrong. It was a really stark example of prediction fever.
And the sources mentioned even more recent predictions, like David Meade in 2017 linking it to astrological signs, or someone named Joshua Malakala apparently predicting 2025. It seemed the pattern continues.
It does. Despite the consistent record of failure and the biblical warnings against date setting, the conviction that the end is knowable and imminent persists within certain streams of this theology.
Okay, let's try to bring this all together. We started with the word rapture, tracing it from a Greek word meaning to snatch or seize through Latin to its current theological usage.
Right, and we saw how that term became attached to a specific, relatively recent doctrine, primarily developed within dispensational premillennialism, starting in the 1830s.
A doctrine that proposes a two-stage return of Christ, separated by a tribulation period, which fundamentally splits it from the historic majority Christian view of a single second coming.
Exactly. The division isn't usually about if Christ will return, but how and when. One event or two, before, during, or after the tribulation.
And even within the group that accepts the two-stage idea, there's that wide spectrum of timing views, pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib, each with very different implications for believers.
Huge implications, particularly regarding suffering and the church's relationship to the predicted end times events.
So for you, the listener, navigating this topic means understanding that the rapture isn't one single universally agreed upon concept. It's really shorthand for a whole complex of beliefs, particularly about timing, that vary significantly.
That's the key takeaway. Knowing whether someone is talking about a pre-tribulation rapture, like in Left Behind, or a post-tribulation rapture, which aligns more closely with historic views on enduring trials, makes a world of difference.
Which leads us to our final thought for you to chew on.
Yeah, so much of the popular discussion around the rapture focuses, understandably, on who gets taken and who is left behind. That's the drama. But maybe a deeper question arises when you compare the core assumptions of the different timing views. Think about pre-tribulationism, promising complete removal before suffering, versus post-tribulationism, which insists the church must endure the suffering of the final age.
Escape versus endurance.
Exactly. So the provocative thought is this. Beyond just who goes and when, what does your belief about the timing of the rapture? Whether you expect rescue from trial or perseverance through trial reveal about your fundamental understanding of faith, suffering, and the church's expected role in the world during times of crisis. Does the doctrine shape the expectation, or does the desired expectation shape the doctrine?
Something to definitely think about. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.